Oh, okay. I guess I'm already recording. Now, Sheltered Instruction, Chapter 1. And the highlights of this chapter, I'm trying to, okay, my viewpoint is to find things in this chapter that are incredibly valuable and you need to know, and not to just fool around talking about everything in the chapter, because some parts of it are just not something that's going to stick with you. Okay, there's something very important on page 2. It talks about student profiles, and you'll see it's got 1, 2, 3, 4. The goal when you're an ESL teacher is you're going to have to act fairly quickly. ESL is not an area where people have spent 150 years thinking about ways to teach grammar, or 50 to 80 years about technology or how to teach chemistry better. ESL is a very rapid and a very new field. And it's only now, I think, establishing itself. It does suffer a little bit from the fact that people resent having to provide ESL classes, because there is resentment against people that are different, that are coming in that don't have the language skills. And you'll hear certain individuals say, well, I don't want to spend tax money on people that should have learned English before they got here. But guess what? Surviving is so important that when people are trying to survive to get here, they don't get here having studied along the way. They had to stay alive along the way. And so unless they had the opportunities to study academically in their own language before they arrived, or if they maybe just studied, didn't even have an education in their own language, so they may not know how to read in whatever language you're coming with. That's always a huge issue, and that's why number 4, it has 4 categories. Very simple. Category 1, balanced bilingual. That means someone comes in, they speak their language, and they speak English fluently or very well. Bilingual means both languages. 2, monolingual, literate native language. Someone comes in, they do not speak English, but they're very well educated. They can read and write in their own language, and that is huge. That means they have educational background. And of course, it means to what degree. Were they in school through maybe a 4th grade level and they're now high school? Or did they go, I've seen students come in that were ready to go to college. They just didn't speak English, but they could go to college in a Spanish-speaking country. All right, because you're dealing with social classes, upper level, lower level. You're dealing with all kinds of trauma. Sometimes I mentioned it in the last video. So you've got, they speak both languages. That's a big plus. 2, if they don't speak English, are they literate and educated in the first language? That's still a big plus. 3rd situation, are they only speak their language, but they were not educated and know very little about reading and writing, even in their own language. That's a tough situation. Not impossible. This means that it takes a lot of flexibility. And then the 4th one is the reverse of number 1, limited bilingual. Maybe they speak some English and they do speak their own language, but it is possible to have weird situations where kids grow up where they never really latched on to a first language. They used English and they used Spanish or whatever their first language is, and they actually are in a twilight zone, and that's not good. I'm a firm believer you need a first language, and it's good to be literate in that first language. So you get it's difficult when kids have to learn to read and write in English, and it's their second language, and they didn't learn how to read and write in their first language. So that gives you, I'm just trying to paint some broad categories for you. Now, they give some examples, and they talk about Nico and Agnesa and Rahul and Luisa, another one. And so these are very good to read because you may find these situations. There's a nice chart here on page 4, and it talks about two things: academic language on the right side, conversational language on the left side. Now, what we call that is we call it BICS, conversational language, basic interpersonal communication skills. That means playground English, day-to-day living English, not writing essays, not reading novels, not even writing papers of any type. Maybe a little bit of reading, in newspapers, but not much more than that. And so conversational language starts at the bottom. They can listen and understand a little bit. That's usually, even if you learn Spanish and you're not very good and you go to Guatemala or Colombia or someplace, and you can listen and understand a little bit with motions and gestures. You can understand a little bit of what people want. But you can only listen. You can't even pronounce the words. You just recognize a few words. And this goes up the whole spectrum. If there were a colored spectrum here, this would be the dark, limited ability, and it gets brighter as you go up to the point you can talk about philosophy, religion, and even politics. Okay? And you can use excellent grammar. So you can see that that goes from very low to very high. Now let's look on the other side, which is academic, and we call that CALPS, cognitive academic language proficiency skills, CALPS, C-A-L-P-S. This is an old term. It's been around for 25 years, 30 years, or more longer. And that is when you have basic skills. You see at the bottom, I know how to raise my hand and get permission to go to the restroom, get a drink of water, sharpen my pencil. I can follow directions from the teacher because there's enough context I can figure out what she wants me to do. This is why talking on the phone is terrible. If you don't know another language, if you can't see the person and all you're doing is talking on the phone, even if you think you understand what they're saying, it's very hard. You can't see anything. There's nothing to observe, so it's very difficult. That scares people, talking on the phone in a language they don't know. Then beginning reading, beginning writing, narrative writing. You notice narrative, telling stories is the first skill in language. Then reading, expository, explanatory. Someone explains about how the solar system was formed. Well, that's a story in a way, but reading it and then reading how to do things, or reading even novels where you have settings that you're not familiar with, then you have to know vocabulary. And not only that, you have to know the culture, you have to know the context. So that is a very high level skill. You do not go to children or even adults trying to learn English and give them some easier version of, In Cold Blood by Capote. None of you know that. It's a great novel. It's actually more of a semi-documentary novel. But you don't give them things that have a lot of pages and a lot of fine letters and a lot of new vocabulary and context and slang. All that stuff, it comes with time. And I want to mention, I was thinking about this, time is something you need to think about with your ELs. And you need as much time as you can get. On the left side, with conversational language, you need two things. You need them to have time, and they need to have time with other kids their own age who speak English and may even speak combination of whatever their language is in English, Spanish, English, Spanglish, you know that. So they need time to adapt. You do not learn English in the classroom. You learn English, especially conversational English. You learn conversational English through outside interaction with speakers, native speakers of English. Same thing, just reverse and think if you went to Central America and you were trying to learn Spanish, you could spend all day in grammar classes. Frankly, that wouldn't be a lot of fun. And you would spend all your time trying to be right every time. You couldn't laugh, it wouldn't be very delightful. But if you could spend it with friends and they're teaching you a little bit at a time and enjoying themselves, and you make your mistakes and you enjoy your mistakes, that makes all the difference in the world. Time is your ally. And when people say, when they sometimes have said, you need to do this within a certain time period, time limits are not good. I know a lot of students that hate when they take praxis. Oh, there's a time limit. You got 30 minutes for this section of practice, or you got an hour and a half for this section of ACT. They immediately stress. Learning English, conversational English, means you have to have the affective filter, which means your emotions have to be, your filter is really a negative thing in this case. Your filter has to be down. Your shields are down. Think about Star Trek, when they're meeting with the ship and they're all friends and people are beaming across to their ship, they don't have their shields up to block things, okay? You don't have the door shut when you welcome your friends in. That's what an affective filter is. It's a shut door. So you want kids to have every opportunity outside of class. This is why ESL teachers have to look at the whole life situation of their students. They're not just doing their 1 hour a day and being immensely successful, fooling themselves if they think that. Academically, that's conversation now. Academically, you have to gradually give them more and more enjoyable but challenging material. That's the old concept from Vygotsky, which if you had teaching or educational psychology or 204 or whatever, you increase the level of difficulty as people are able to do it. It's the same thing with weight training. If you're going to learn to lift 100 pounds, you don't go in the first day having never done it and start out with a 70-pound weight. You find your level and you stay within that, get accustomed so your muscles don't kill you, and then you move up. And so you move up and suddenly you're doing 20 pounds and 30 pounds and 50 pounds, and you move up until you get to 100 pounds, okay? That same metaphor is true for especially academic English, because it's easy to crush people in a class. You have all experienced this when you go to a class. Maybe it's an English lit class or or in math. When someone gives you a book and you open it up and it's a big book and you go into chapter 3 and 4 and 5 and you just get scared. You see, oh my gosh, what are matrices in mathematics? Some of you know this, I've forgotten. I know what they look like, but I'm not encouraged. I wouldn't want to deal with them. What are quadratic equations? If you know about them, you're comfortable. You look beyond them. If you don't know what they are, you want to take baby steps. You want to learn a little bit about parts of equations and move up slowly and master it a little bit at a time. That's what academic English is. And the difference in the BICS and the conversational is that because you're in a more relaxed situation, it's not as difficult. You wouldn't want to be in a situation learning conversational English where you get either embarrassed or slapped in the face or an electric shock every time you make a mistake. That would sharpen your focus, but it wouldn't. It'd make you a very uptight person. So, what are we looking at with, and I've already mentioned the types of programs. You actually see that on instruction on page 6. This kind of blends in what I've already mentioned. But, and then on page 9, This is important stuff. Okay. The stuff about two-way immersion and all that stuff, don't worry about it. We're not going to be doing any programs in ESL that have that kind of richness of resources. If you ever get to a school can do that, go for it. It'll be wonderful. That'll mean you got all kinds of experts around you helping you. I always look at this. So you're going to go to a program where you're kind of the expert because you exist. Okay. Now, English language knowledge. It says here, English proficiency is the greatest predictor of school success. Absolutely. It's not the only predictor. It doesn't guarantee it. But if the student is not very proficient in English, they're going to struggle because they'll be put in content classes. And if they don't have the requisite skills, they'll have trouble reading the material, they'll have trouble doing the examinations, etc. English speakers in college at UNK experience this too when they get into an area where they're not comfortable. And I mentioned a while ago about novels and textbooks that have a lot of people in math have trouble with word problems, and they're not ESL students, they're not ELs. They're students that just never quite got comfortable with it in school. I know people that struggle with math, and they struggle with the math on the praxis test. People say, oh, it's just basic college algebra. Well, college algebra is not simple. And if math was one of your areas of weakness, then you're going to be uptight about it. Certainly on page 10, 11, talks about language and talks about BICS and CALPS and focus on that. They talk about the iceberg analogy. And you know Titanic, everybody knows the movie, right? Whatever you saw above the waves, there was a lot more of the iceberg below the waves. It's also true of our personalities. It's also true about life. Most of what we see is not what all there is, okay? But it's important to remember when you're dealing with ESL that the argument here is the BICS is what you see above the waves, that you see conversational English like I'm saying to you. That is not difficult. It's relatively, you can be very comfortable with it. But the academic aspects, which I could, if I push, depends on how I teach this class, if I pushed a lot of grammar structure, and you see this chart over here on the left side, page 10, phonology, morphology, syntax, pragmatics, semantics. Imagine if that was those are the words I used in most of my lesson. You say morphology. Okay, what's morphology? Phonology, the sound of words. Morphology, the origin of words. Syntax, the order of words in a sentence. So you see this little iceberg over here, aren't they cute? You never see nice penguins on them or anything. So we know academic language is a challenge. That's why college is difficult. Not everybody goes to college because college is not guaranteed. Just because you speak English doesn't mean you can write good essays or you can give speeches or you can think logically. Now, something that's always going to be useful to you is this little assessment device called the Solemn Language Observation Matrix on page 13. This is something you could copy and keep for the rest of your life in a folder, and you would use it. It just gives you a way to kind of get an idea how to define comprehension, fluency, vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar. And I like it because it allows you to kind of go across and get an idea. Oh, my student is very fluent. They actually understand conversations. And then people make the mistake. And what I always tell people, big important piece of advice here. A lot of students may speak English and they're fluent in English, and you think, wow, they're native. And then they go to their writing class and reading classes, and you find out that they're down here on a level that grammar and word order errors make comprehension difficult. They may have problems with pronunciation when they get into more complex vocabulary. They don't know how to pronounce words. They have no phonological instruction, or they simply have been exposed to language to know words on sight. So these are issues that trip up. And you as an ESL teacher, you're going to have to give instruction, enlighten regular classroom teachers and the principals, because they will say, this kid seems fine with his English. He's just being lazy because he can't do his homework. No, not true. That's the same as saying that because you speak English, you should be able to do math and do word problems. You should be able to read a book on, I don't know, banking, economics, and you should be able to figure it out fairly quickly and watch the charts and stuff. But you don't have that kind of academic background because no one gave you the baby steps in the first place to read diagrams, or to, maybe you don't know how charts are created and stuff. So then they come to this on page 15, the little stages of language acquisition. And this is a very useful little thing in this book. That's why I like this book. It kind of has this class is kind of a composite of everything you need to know, slightly quickie version, okay? Beginning, early intermediate, early advanced, and advanced. And you can read those. Those are important stuff in here, okay? I'm trying to help you here. Page 15 is important stuff on it, so you want to know that. And then you can go through and there's another thing I'm not quite as, well, they use it. Here's an example of how somebody divided up their English language program. And if you have, you look at this and say, but what if I only had 3 students? Well, you don't really have to worry about this too much. You have to think about how to work with them. But if you end up in a school and you're in charge of starting or at least running the ESL program, and you find you have 47 students, new students to test and deal with, then you're going to have to learn other things. One of those will be use of the screening test in Nebraska called the ELPA test, ELPA. The test they use now every year to see how well ESL students are doing is called the ELPA 21, okay? That's a whole nother lecture, okay? I think I've exposed you to well, I'm teaching several classes right now. They're very similar to this class. So I know I've mentioned it, but I'm not sure I've mentioned it to you. You will get that information in the assessment class about ELPA. Okay, now, what are some other issues? Kind of finishing up this chapter. Here's some really important things to know. You may get ESL students who have problems pronouncing words because of speech impairments. You may have students that are autistic. You may have students that have undiagnosed SPED conditions. You may have students that have learning disabilities, not readily apparent, not just like you can tell. And you will have to, as much as possible. Now, if you have someone with this, a more definite syndrome like Down syndrome or something that is physically, no one would argue that they need SPED services, you have to be very careful. You cannot put ESL kids, ELs, do not go into special education unless they are tested in their native language or tested by some professional who can say, yes, they need SPED, they qualify for SPED services, okay? A lot of times students will end up in Title, which is students that are behind, but they're not in a category. They just need extra help in reading or usually reading, but it could be writing. I'm going to tell you the relationship. The better you read, the better you write. Writing by itself and writing is not really helpful. It's reading, because you feed the patterns of language and the expressions used by other people and vocabulary and learning vocabulary. You drink that in in reading. The more books I read, the more I am able to think about the way that author stated things. And I like their expressions. And the more I read that, the better I write. This is my viewpoint. I think it's right. I think it'd be hard to say someone's a good writer, but they've never read books is ridiculous. Language has to come from somewhere. Now, they may be a very good writer in terms of conversation because they're very conversational, but I don't really see people that are conversationally very advanced who haven't read. Okay. For instance, that thing we talked about, if you're able in basic speaking to talk about politics and concepts like that, or philosophy or scientific theories, well, that meant you've read a lot, because you wouldn't be able to even talk about that. It doesn't come up in regular conversation. It's like talking about climate change, but without any details. Sure hot today. Wow, where is that? Where is that? Well, or if it's cold, you say, where is climate change when you need it? It doesn't operate that way, you know. Just because the world is getting warmer doesn't mean all the world's getting warmer at the same time. That's a breakdown in logic. So they have three-tiered system. They have the triangle. And you can tell that theoretically a small 5% of ELs will need intensive assistance one-on-one for a longer duration to help them begin to build up their skills so they can succeed in school. This is generally a hopeful thing. It says that most students, tier 1, 80% with basic good ESL practice, and I'm looking at this as strictly ESL, all right, that a lot of them, if you have quality ESL programs and you push them toward getting into regular mainstream classes, or you have sheltered classes, which means mainstream classes with ESL protection built in, you know, some extra benefits, that you should be able to get the core and certainly the 15% that need more help. You should be able to work with them, and that only 5% will take up the more one-on-one time. This is a pretty optimistic, you know, 80% will get it, 15% will need some fairly serious help, and 5% are going to really struggle. I don't know if you could say that. You know, I'd love to have this pyramid and take it to a math class or something, you know, and say 80% of the students are going to pass this calculus class, and 15% will need some more intense help, and 5% are just going to be in terrible trouble. I don't think that's true, but it's nice. Okay, so they talk about the tiers, and that's basically going to wind up the chapter. And they talk about profiles. Now, what profiles deal with really is placement. And what placement deals with is assessment. Now, I address this in TE 329, what you need for the ESL endorsement. So I'm kind of leaving assessment to the ESL class 329. I'm not going to teach all the classes and all the concepts across the board in sheltered instruction. We're going to be focusing now on teaching ESL students. And then, as I mentioned, I'm going to be working with ESL types of programs, and really I can nail it down to those first 5 I just talked about in the other video. And then types of instructional approaches. And I mentioned those on the, just in the introduction for this week. Just to give you a heads up, language translation, grammar translation, that's the old. Memorize the conjugations like I did in school. My Spanish teacher, I learned tons of Spanish, but we did some practice with drills. In other words, I go, you go, he goes, she goes, we go. Now in English, those don't change very much. It seems like all of them are go with goes. But in Spanish, every one of those is different. And German's the same way. And so you actually drill those, so you just kind of get them in your head, and then you reproduce them without having to think. There's some places a little memorization is quite useful. I always thought memorizing the multiplication tables was useful. But who wants to use a calculator to figure what's 9 times 7? 63. It just pops up in my head. I know that. Now, I never memorized what's 96 times 8. Never memorized that. I did think of some ways I could do it once it gets close to 100 and then subtract. But in some countries, they actually memorize really kind of cool and somewhat sophisticated ways to memorize multiplying 2- and 3-digit numbers times each other. But I'm just giving you that example of the multiplication tables. 9 times 9 was where I stopped off. Well, 10 times 10 is easy. So some of that is useful, grammar translation. The other one was audiolingual. Now I'll go into these. And then what I want to expose you to is, so you know about these, you may choose to use some of these. Now in this class online, I'm not going to make you create units and teach, because it's online. It's not really very convenient for that. But I am very interested and kind of excited about talking about some of the methods that, and I can even tell you, one of them kind of involves hypnotism. Now, I'm not going to hypnotize anybody because that ethically is a little weird. You can't really do it. First of all, I have hypnotized people, and not just by my video, smart aleck. I have hypnotized people and regressed them back to when they were children. And I only did it like a couple of times, and it was just so strange. I got them to when they were 7 years old, and then I didn't know what to do. So I kind of just, okay, now we're going back. Okay, now you're 28. And so I did that, and the person actually talked like they were a 6-year-old, which was creepy because it was like having a superpower. And I thought, wow, my voice must really be boring. But it would actually put people into a hypnotic state. I think that you have to want to be hypnotized. But still, but that was a method of teaching English. Not a very widespread one, but it was used. There was another one, give you an idea. It's called total physical response. And it's almost like teaching dance. You actually say, touch your head. Okay, touch your ears. And you do things like that and repeat it in patterns, and people figure it out. And they like it because they're actually moving. It's kind of like, I've been studying how to do shuffle dancing, which I will not demonstrate at this particular time. However, it is interesting. And maybe I'll share that sometime. I've threatened to do that before. But you have to learn to move pretty fast. So you have to practice a lot. Anyhow, well, I'm going to stop right now. So I think that I've given you what sheltered content is. I've mainly given you preliminaries. So I hope this has been helpful to you. It may have been a little bit long, but since I don't get to spend any time with you and you don't get popcorn, unless you want to show up on Wednesdays at 6:30, I can do that. So adios.